In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a decorative bezel with a pancake die from PotterUSA. First of all, you're going to need a pancake die and some silver. Here I'm using sterling silver. If you're going to use fine silver, it'll make your bezel easier to push over, but you need to make sure that it's been rolled very, very stiff with a rolling mill before using it in a pancake die. Make sure the bottom of your metal is level straight across the bottom of the pancake die so that you don't have to even out the bottom of your bezel later. So I'm going to go ahead and cut out my silver, and then I will have my decorative bezel strip ready to go. So you can see here I have this nice strip cut out. This is 20 gauge sterling silver. It's going to make it a bit stiffer for me to actually set the stone, but that's what I had on hand. So now I'm going to figure out the length of material I need for this stone. I'm using a strip of paper wrapped around the stone, and then I marked where the two meet. And I'm going to use this to determine how much metal I need. I typically add, in addition to this overall length, you have to allow for the thickness of the metal itself. So I add 2 to 3 times the thickness of the metal beyond the length of the paper. And for 20 gauge, that thickness is 0.8 millimeters. So I'm adding about 2 millimeters to the end of my bezel here. Now I'm going to go ahead and just cut this end, and I want to make sure I cut it nice and square as possible. I'm still going to have to file it. So I've removed the excess, and now I'm going to go ahead and use a flat file to make sure the ends are perfectly even so they'll come together nicely for soldering. So I filed that first end, and now I'm going to file this other end so that I know they're both completely flat. My ends are filed now, but I have this burr on the back side from the pancake die, and that's just because I was using a fairly thin metal and it wasn't fully hard. So I could use a file to remove that burr, but I like to use these PSA sanding discs. So I'm going to go ahead and use my flex shaft with the sanding disc to quickly remove that burr on the reverse side. Once that's done, I'm ready to anneal. And what this does is it will make the metal nice and soft so that I can shape it and bring the ends together for soldering. If this was fine silver, I probably would not have to do this. I wouldn't need to anneal, but because it's sterling, it's really stiff, so I do need to anneal it. Now to bend it, I'm going to use these pliers that are half round and half flat, and that's just so that I don't leave tool marks on the outside of my bezel. I'm not super worried about shaping this bezel perfectly right now. What I'm mostly worried about is bringing the ends together for soldering. We can do some of the shaping after it's been soldered. I am going to try to get it roughly to the right shape, but not exact. When I bring those ends together, I want to make sure I bring them together nice and square in a butt joint so that when I solder, I get a nice strong seam. And if one side is a little wonky, they're just not quite level, I'm going to use my parallel pliers to just flatten those two pieces out so that they come together perfectly. And once I have a really nice tight fit, I'm ready to go solder. So this looks nice. I don't see any major gaps or anything like that. It looks like I can go ahead and solder. I'm gonna flux my seam, and because I'm using sterling, I might get some fire scale, but I can sand that off afterwards. So I'm heating up my flux here and adding a little solder chip. I'm gonna get two ready just in case, and then I'm gonna go ahead and heat really evenly and then add my solder chips to my seam. And I'm actually gonna place them on the inside of this bezel because that way I'll have less cleanup to do. I'll still have to file and clean up the outside edge of this bezel, but I won't have to worry quite so much about excess solder if it's on the inside of the bezel. Just still placing these little solder chips. The flux was kind of fighting me a little bit. And now we're ready to just heat evenly and get this bezel soldered. So you can see I'm directing my torch at the back side, and that's just because the heat will draw the solder through that seam. And now my solder's melted. Go ahead and pickle it and then take a look. So this is after it's been pickled. It looks pretty good. That joint isn't quite perfectly flat, but it's soldered, and now we're ready to do our final shaping. Here I'm using an oval ring mandrel. It's not quite the same shape oval as my stone, but it'll give me a rough guide to form over so that I can get this shaped to fit my cabochon. And I like to use a nylon mallet. Remember not to hit this with a metal hammer, because if you do, it will stretch the metal and your bezel will end up likely being too large for your stone. So make sure you're only using a metal hammer if you need to purposefully stretch the bezel larger. So I'm just continuing to shape this and test it on the stone to gauge fit. Just lightly tapping with the nylon mallet so that I can get this shaped without marring the surface. I'm pretty close, but it's not quite perfect yet. And I think one of the things that's keeping it from being perfect is I have that excess solder on the inside of the bezel. So I'm going to go ahead and use a sandpaper roll to remove this excess solder that's in here. And I think that'll help make the fit perfect. So now we'll check the fit again. It's fitting better. I think it's just about perfect. There is this one little spot that's not quite right. So I'm gonna go ahead and fix those. Actually, it's two little areas where there's just a little bit of a high spot in the oval. So we'll go ahead and go back to the mandrel, tap those areas down, and then we should be good to go. We'll check the fit one more time. Okay, and that feels just about perfect. So now I'm almost ready to solder the back plate on, but first I need to make sure the bottom of my bezel is perfectly flat and level. And so I'm marking this with a Sharpie so that when I sand the back, I can tell where the high and low spots are. And then I'm using this is a diamond knife sharpening block from Harbor Freight. I think it's about a $12 tool, but it's really perfect for sanding things flat. So I'm just gonna continue to work on this. It took me about probably 10 minutes to sand this flat, but I've sped it up for the purposes of the video. And then I'm double checking to make sure my stone still fits in there and that everything is good and the shape hasn't changed. And once I've done all that, I'm ready to solder on the back plate. So I'm elevating this up just a little bit, and the little piece that I'm elevating it up on is just a thin piece of steel strapping that was basically trash at the hardware store. They use it to wrap like pallets of wood, and sometimes I'll just snag a piece of it from the trash can at the hardware store if I see it, and I use it to make these little V-shapes to lift my pieces up off the soldering board so that I can heat from beneath. So I fluxed this, and I'm going to add my little solder chips, and I'm going to add them to the inside of my bezel. There's different schools of thought on this. I could add them to the outside and it would be fine. I'm going to add them to the inside because it just means less cleanup for me. The downside is that if you don't get all the solder to flow completely and perfectly flat, if you end up with any solder lumps in there, you do risk cracking your stone when you go to set it. So you need to remove any excess solder that doesn't flow flat. But that's fairly easy to do. So this is my preferred method. And I'm just placing my solder chips, and then once they're placed, I can heat very evenly, heat from below, and just heat until the solder flows and pull it with the heat all the way around the full length of the bezel. And then I'm ready to pickle, and this is after taking it out of the pickle. It looks like I have a really good clean solder join all the way around the bottom edge of that bezel. So now I'm ready to just saw this out with my jeweler's saw. You might have noticed there's like a texture on my backplate metal. It was just some scrap that I had, and I made the texture face up because I don't want it showing. It wasn't a deep enough texture that it's gonna mess with the solder joint or anything like that. So I've sawn off the excess metal, and now I'm ready to just file it flush to the edge of the bezel. And I went ahead and filed and sanded, and now I'm gonna add this is like a small silver bead that I filed a flat spot on, and I'm going to solder it to the top of my bezel so that I can attach like a jump ring and turn this into a pendant. And I am fluxing the whole piece because I would like to avoid fire scale if possible. Okay, so I'm heating this piece up evenly, adding my little solder chip to the bead itself, flowing the solder on the bead, and then placing the bead right up against my bezel, and then I can just heat the bezel until the solder flows from the bead to the bezel. Okay, that looks pretty good. So again, I'll just pickle it and clean it. And this is after pickling. My solder join looks pretty clean and everything looks like it attached well. So now I'm just ready for final finishing. I do have some fire scale on the back here, so I'm gonna go ahead and sand that off. And now I'm ready to set my stone. I'm using some Thermalock plastic here. We'll see if this works. I don't have like a rim or anything around that bezel, so it's gonna be a little tricky to hold it in the Thermalock, but I'm gonna go ahead and try. And then I'll just let the air cool that plastic for a minute until it's nice and hard, and then I'll be ready to set the stone. So I'm using my bezel punch and a chasing hammer. And this metal, because it's sterling silver, it's pretty stiff to push over the stone, but it'll move with the punch and the chasing hammer. It's just going to take a lot more effort than a fine silver bezel would. And it's just popping out of that Thermalock, so I'm going to go ahead and use the pins in this vise instead and go ahead and set the whole stone. And now you can see I just have a little bit of finishing work to remove the hammer marks from the punch, which I don't want on this bezel. So I'm using a pumice wheel and some fine sandpaper rolls to remove those marks. And then once that's done, I've polished and the bezel is completed. And you can see that there are a variety of these different decorative bezel dies on PotterUSA's site. Check them out.